Our final presenter is Dr. Analía Porrás, Unit Chief, Medicines and Health Technologies of the Pan American Health Organization. So welcome to Analía.
Good morning, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this presentation. I think it's an interesting topic that basically takes every day of my life lately. But today, I guess, I've been invited to talk specifically on the regulatory system strengthening in Latin America and how this relates to access. So I think it's a great opportunity because it might be obvious to this audience, but in general, quality was historically considered separate from access. And the paradigm has shifted over the years, and now quality and regulation, it sees as an integral part of access to medicine. So just a quick view. Countries, especially countries in our region, do not always get the best investment in terms of the expenditures in medicines. The panel here shows a quick study that we did on the same drug, same medicine, efavirenz 6 mg, compared among some of our countries. And as you can see, the price difference was humongous among different countries in the regions, unrelated to the capacity to pay, ability to pay, or unrelated to size. So in this, especially in HIV/AIDS patients, end up, when we look at this in 2012, 75 to 90% of the expenditure on treatment for these patients goes to medicines, just medicine. So only, I think it was Anita mentioning that we have very little money left for other things. So I don't know who made it in the presentation. So if 90% of the treatment, it's medicines, as you can imagine, everything gets second or third stage. And of that, 71% of the patients are on first line of treatment. But yet, 52 or 55% of the expenditure went to second and third line treatment. So a small number of medicine took more than 50% of the expenditure at that time. So when you look at these numbers, you realize why. This is one country that we are doing a price comparisons between what the country was paying and what actually PAHO offers to countries through the strategic fund, which is a pool procurement mechanisms to improve access to quality generics, especially for HIV, TB, and malaria, the three main product lines. And as you can see, without going into details, the country was basically overpaying by 13 million what they could have gotten by 1 million. For the same number of drugs and same volumes. The price differential of the medicines in countries, especially countries with small markets, where innovators are the rule, it's, I can say it's even obscene, because there's no reason that this should happen. And as you know, in Latin America, at least 70% of the medicines for this kind of programs, from vertical programs, come from public funding without any global fund or other donor funds. So the impact in the budget is, I would say, more than significant. So moving forward, I'm not going to dwell on this very much, but in 2016, countries in the region adopted, which I would call a very, very progressive resolution called Access and Rational Use of Strategic and High-Cost Medicines and Other Health Technologies. It only took 6 months to negotiate, so I would say the long name reflects the converse very complicated negotiation, because all the countries from Canada to Argentina voted unanimously for this framework. And the resolution, the aim of the resolution was to help countries identify the best policies and strategies for increasing access to these products without excessive cost to their health budget. and calls for countries to work together on multiple fronts. It's very comprehensive. It touches all of the areas you've been discussing, but the one I would talk about is the strengthened regulatory system to ensure the quality of the medicines that are in the market. And those are the policy options. So having said that, let me give you a little bit of history. Latin America has been a pioneer in putting regulation at the forefront of public health agenda. And after the PANDRA was created in 1998. It's a regulatory network that kind of convenes all regulatory authorities from the region, again from Canada to Argentina. And this was more trying to come together, harmonize standards, come together with guidelines. Honestly, didn't work that well. Because harmonizing, coming to a common standard is almost impossible when you don't have such a legal governance framework like the EU has, or another political kind of overarching pressure to do that. But it did something. It did bring a bunch of regulatory authorities discussing this for many years, and it created trust. It created trust to the level that then a certain number of national regulatory authorities got together in Mexico and decided that they needed to benchmark themselves against a common standard. And they asked PAHO to develop that standard based on a WHO standard for pre-qualification of vaccines. Not easy, but very courageous. PAHO came up with a tool by which we will go and evaluate regulatory authorities in the region. Basically, we were the coordinating entity, but the evaluators were peers from other regulatory authorities. It was voluntary, and it aimed at producing information on how those regulatory authorities behave and function in order to create trust for other regulatory authorities and for different markets. In 2010, that was reflected in a resolution, when I'm going to talk a little bit more about it now, but basically today we have more than, or last year, 24 national regulatory systems have been assessed, and that data is shared amongst all regulatory authorities that participate. You're going to see only the public side because it has sensitive information, but if you're a regulatory authority that has been assessed, you can access the information on any other regulatory authority that has been assessed by PAHO. What is the point of that program? The program is not to benchmark just for the sake of it, but is to create trust, to create a guiding plan, an institutional development plan for strengthening the regulatory authority, aiming at that each country in the region has a regulatory authority that is functional, that it's context-specific for their health system, and that tries to be efficient, uses as much as possible the resources, leverage the work of others. So we move a little bit from harmonization to convergence, which is something that ends up being, might be doing different things, but we might reach the same decision because the criteria is similar, but the process might be different. And I want to emphasize the context specific because, as you imagine, we have countries like Brazil and Mexico, which markets are very, very big. Countries like some islands in the Caribbean that are smaller than a city in the US. So it makes no sense to have the same regulatory authority in those different environments. So the resolution actually, I'm going to skip that, end up creating a very complex system during 2010, which is another resolution. It's the first region that adopted a resolution on regulatory system strengthening. And it created 4 levels of regulatory authority. Level 4 is the most advanced. It's what we call functional, and that doesn't mean everybody that's in that group is the same. But you reach the threshold where you can ensure the effectiveness, safety, and quality of the medicines in your market. And we allow us to map that and to present data of how the region is behaving in the regulatory aspect, and then also to allow other countries that might need to rely on regulatory decisions from those countries to make sure they rely on data and not on reputation. So we all know that the FDA is a great regulatory agency, the same for Canada, but they went through the assessment too. So they have the data to show that. We use as a framework that we develop based, it's not mind-blowing, it's obvious, but basically it has a set of principal cross-cutting elements and co-regulatory functions. And according to your market, if you are a manufacturer, you're not a manufacturer, if you have our importer, we evaluate the major product categories, and you have to achieve a number of indicators that are very precisely defined, have indicator sheets, and that actually are well defined. So it takes away a lot of the lack of objectivity that we have when some of the system is evaluated, because people come with their own ideas, and remember, these are peer review. But the point is that when we go to an agency, and we just evaluated El Salvador, who, based on this system, created basically an agency from scratch in the last 5 years. We do the evaluation, we help them develop an institutional development plan with a priority setting and with clear goals and objectives based on the context and on their priorities. Then we provide technical support, but also by PAHO directly, but we emphasize the use of bilateral, multilateral support, especially for these agencies that already reached level 4. We relied on networks and sometimes an international expert. Basically, we do this several times and we check the progress in order to ensure that the agencies are progressing toward a more functional system. Today, we have 69% of the countries in the region evaluated, and the ones you see below are the ones that have reached level 4. Some of them have been re-evaluated already, like Brazil, like Argentina and Cuba, and also COFEPRIS. Actually, I think almost all of them had been re-evaluated except Chile, because it was the last to be to reach that. Chile spent 9 years at level 3, so it needed a little bit push. And part of the bioequivalence, and this is a good example, in both Mexico and Chile, the reason they were very strong with the bioequivalence, because these are the ones we were telling them, you're not there yet. So they have to push. So there is a relationship between this and what's going on the countries. So this is our first basic evaluation. As you could see, there is some of the regions are very strong, while regions like the Caribbean are yet very, very weak. So there had to be a way of these small islands to do it, and this is the one and this is the data we have. I'm going to rush by because we put the data in PRICE, which is a regional observatory, and I want to tell you a little bit about the Caribbean, and a little bit referring to Veronica's, the other Veronica, not this, idea of a unique regulatory system, which I agree it's not, I would say it's not feasible, and also I wouldn't say it would solve the problem that we are seeing. But in the case of the Caribbean, we have very little islands with very small population and a small market. The idea of working together within the CARICOM framework, which is a legal framework, actually has picked up. So the Caribbean islands developed a pharmaceutical policy, and a few years ago, now developed what we call the CRS, the Caribbean Regulatory System. It's a single entry point for generic registration within CARPHA, the public health agency. It has the full support of PAHO. It has initial support from Gates, financial support, and the FDA. And actually what it does, it has a single entry based on registration on a regulatory authority that it's strong and functional. It could be the European Union, could be the FDA. So that gives you a threshold of quality, and then the medicines, the manufacturers can present that to enter the market. It's very recent creation, but it already has, I think, over 17 registration, mostly of HIV products, that it's trying to put pressure and availability, which is a big problem in the region that has many stockouts. But let me show you. This, as you can see, are not my slides. They come from COFEPRIS, which is the Mexican regulatory authorities. I want to make a direct relationship between better regulation and access. When COFEPRIS pushed that, when Mexico tried to push the generic policy, they needed to start at the regulatory authority. So what they wanted to show is that if they have a systematic registration of priority products, so they put out those packages. So they will call for the 10 most expensive medicines I'm making the number up because I don't remember how many, but there were packages calling for registration of priority medicines. And then that will create in itself competition, and that will reduce the prices. And this is what it's shown here, that medicines in the private sector, where those are in pesos, and once they included in that particular category a number of registration, they put downward pressures on the market. And I'm going to skip this. This correlates, of course, with generic penetration for those specific medicines and the decrease of out-of-pocket spending. And that's data that the COFEPRIS very kindly allow us to use. So just a note, we are trying to do the same kind of approach with devices, which it's even more of a burden than medicines in many of our countries. And what are we doing to, since we're not having a single regulatory authority, we're trying to allow countries to work together in innovative way. One of the examples is MDSAP. MDSAP is made for devices. It's a consortium between Canada, and I'm finishing with this, Canada, FDA, Australia, Japan, and Brazil, which would, if generics are many, devices goes by the logarithmic multiplication. It's impossible to inspect all these facilities around the world. So they rely on third-party auditors, and now the same auditor is sending the report to all these agencies. What this will happen, the MDSAP, is actually have one auditor go to one place, use the same standard, and go through a platform that PAHO is hosting. PAHO is creating the global, it's actually going to be launched soon, the single entry place. And then the regulatory authorities will decide what to do, and if all of them accept, it has going to have an MDSAP approved signature. So that will allow also to provide information all around. All this is in price, and I thank you because my time is over. Thank you very much.